Okay, thank you, Mark, and thank you for coming. Thank you for the panelists for some interesting insights. The risk of going last on a panel like this is that, of course, all the interesting things will have already been said. And true enough, the issues that I wanted to address this morning are already squarely on the table, and this is not necessarily a bad thing. What I want to try to do is sort of see if I can push the discussion a little bit further. When I was talking to Mark about what I would talk about this morning, he, reflecting what he said at the beginning about reconceptualizing and rethinking SSR, asked me to think about some of the key challenges for SSR going forward. And I want to frame my remarks around sort of three critical challenges, I think, that, as I say, have already been mentioned by my fellow panelists. The three are questions of ownership, particularly local ownership, questions of coordination, and questions of persistence. So let me start with the local ownership question. And perhaps at the risk of getting on Walter's bad side, let me start by saying that in terms of how SSR has been operationalized, in my view, the conventional approach has really been to try to make their security institutions as much as possible like our security institutions. And I think that this approach has increasingly come under scrutiny, and growing attention, I think, now is being paid, as we've heard, to this broader question of local ownership in SSR. And I think in this sense, the SSR community is slowly learning a lesson that the development community has learned over the course of decades of field work, which is that unless you have a high degree of local commitment, local engagement, and indeed local ownership, reform processes will rarely succeed and they will rarely be sustainable. And it's in this context within the SSR field, it's no accident that one of the most successful SSR cases that there is out there in the real world is that of South Africa, where this was an SSR process that was largely locally driven, broadly consultative, and is seen by the majority of South Africans, despite the problems, as being broadly representative, as being legitimate, and as reflecting the genuine needs of South Africans. The question of local ownership has been incorporated into much of the official discourse on SSR in recent years. The OECD DAC that we've heard about already, in their recent literature on security sector reform, the question of local ownership is very much front and center. The key challenge, I think, is how to translate the principle of local ownership into practice. And in this sense, I was heartened, and I wholeheartedly agree with what Roy said earlier, that in terms of how to get the locals on board with SSR, we don't really know. So I'll, in some ways, Roy has liberated me from the challenge of trying to answer the question of how to achieve local ownership. What I will try to do is try to contextualize why I think this problem is such a vexing issue with regard to SSR. And I think there are three brief reasons I want to mention. The first gets at the question of what do we mean by local ownership. And here I think we can break down the question of what does ownership mean from the question of who are the locals. In terms of ownership, I think we've seen two very different and in some ways competing interpretations of what ownership means. You often hear ownership, and we've heard it already this morning, in the context of buy-in. And in my view, that is still sort of understanding ownership as outsiders trying to convince locals to buy into, to accept a vision of SSR and what the security sectors in their own countries should look like, which is still based on a model which is conceptualized and articulated from the outside. Now I contrast this with what I call a more substantive definition of ownership, which I borrow from Laurie Nathan, who has written extensively about the South African experience. And I would just quote it briefly. He argues that the principle of local ownership means that the reform of security policies, institutions, and activities in a given country must be designed, managed, and implemented by domestic actors rather than external actors. So in my view, that's a very different understanding of what ownership means, and I think you still have a differentiation between a more of a top-down notion of local ownership and a bottom-up notion of local ownership. And I don't think these two conceptions have really been reconciled in the SSR literature. The second point, I think, is that we still don't have a clear sense, or the SSR community doesn't really have as clear a sense as it perhaps should, of who we are talking about when we talk about the locals. And since Stephen and I clearly were under strict instructions to quote Mark Sidder's work in our presentations, let me give my pitch for Mark's work. Mark and I think it was Jonathan Goodhand wrote an article on SSR in Afghanistan, and they made a nice distinction, I think, between regime ownership on the one hand and national ownership on the other hand. Right? So the difference between government ownership of an SSR process and a more broadly based societal ownership of SSR. And again, very different implications and very different understandings of who the locals are, who the relevant locals are. So if we look at an example like police reform in Haiti, for example, we can look at various different sets of local owners, right? The political elites, obviously, the Haitian National Police themselves as a second crucial set of owners, and civil society broadly understood as a third set. Given all this, I'm not sure the SSR community has really gone as far as it needs to in terms of actually understanding the dynamic among these various sets of local owners, the fact that there are often differing interests among the local owners, how those differing interests get reconciled. The other example I would raise is in terms of what are the boundaries of legitimate local ownership, right? To go to Afghanistan, are the Taliban local owners in a context? Are the warlords who continue to operate their own militias, should they be seen somehow as local owners who should be at the table when we talk about SSR, or are they somehow beyond the pale? A third question, I think, with regard to actually the challenge of operationalizing local ownership is that in many real-world cases, and this is particularly a problem with post-conflict peace-building processes, is that the principle of local ownership is often in direct contradiction with the normative underpinnings of the broader SSR enterprise. So in Afghanistan, for example, if we talk about the rule of law sector, I think the interests of key local owners are clearly incompatible with the vision of SSR portrayed by the OECD DAC, for example, which talks about a professional, democratically accountable security sector guided by a public service approach to security provision. So I think the tension that emerges in such cases is that you can have local ownership or you can have SSR as conventionally understood. You may not be able to have both. And again, this is one of the tensions that is difficult to reconcile. And ultimately, I think it comes back to something that Stephen noted in his presentation, that SSR is something which must be negotiated rather than imposed. That doesn't answer the question, however, in terms of how to reconcile some of these things. And there remain some very difficult questions that need to be worked through. One of which I think comes back to the question of whether local ownership is premised on local acceptance of liberal democratic principles, including those of human rights, democratic governance, the broader good governance framework, or whether these principles are in fact part of what needs to be negotiated in any SSR process. I was struck by Jennifer's question to Walter and to the response back about the question of gender and how gender fits into the broader question of SSR. And I think what emerges here is again another tension between local ownership as respecting local culture, which in many cases is the source of legitimacy for locals who are engaging in such processes, and in fact transforming local cultures because they don't necessarily correspond to what we outsiders perceive to be as international norms of domestic good governance. So I think, again, the next generation of SSR, if we can talk in those terms, I think needs to be more aware, both conceptually and practically, of some of these complexities underlying both the discourse and the practice of how local ownership plays out in specific contexts. Second issue I wanted to raise gets to this question of coordination, again, raised by some of my colleagues on the panel. And I think it's probably fair to say that coordination problems are endemic to SSR, just as coordination problems are endemic to peace building, or perhaps endemic to anything that the international community engages in. My own first involvement with security sector reform was through a project that I worked on for something called the Stability Pact for Southeastern Europe a number of years ago. And the Stability Pact was sort of tasked us to try to do an inventory of security sector reform initiatives in the region. And I think in the back of their mind, they had an idea that if we can have a sense of who's doing what, we can try to insert ourselves and try to play a greater coordinating role, right? Try to make it more strategic, try to make it more coherent. And I learned two things from this experience. The first is simply the enormity and the diversity of the range of actors involved in SSR initiatives in any individual country, right? From NGOs to donor country development agencies to international organizations, not to mention the plethora of local actors involved, such that even making an inventory of what's going on in SSR in a particular country is an enormous challenge. The second thing I learned was that while most of the actors involved in SSR recognize the need for greater coordination, very few of them actually want to be coordinated. And this is partly, I think, because accountability mechanisms tend to run back to national capitals, and partly because actors involved in SSR have their own ideas about what SSR is and how it should be implemented. So as a consequence, many initiatives either duplicate or work at cross purposes to others with obvious costs, as we've heard, in terms of both efficiency and effectiveness. Haiti, to just give one example, for a number of years after Aristide's departure, had two competing police reform plans, each one of which was pushed by a different coalition of international actors. Now, the coordination problem in SSR, I think, is exacerbated by the fact that it's not just a question of coordinating activity within a particular subsector, say police reform, but also ensuring coordination across the different elements of the SSR domain. And a key lesson, and I think Robert mentioned this and gave the same example that I'm about to give, a key lesson from Haiti is that pursuing police reform at the expense of a broader emphasis on the rule of law and judicial reform can create dangerous imbalances in the system. And Robert mentioned the tendency at a certain point of police officers who justifiably lack confidence in the judicial system to be more inclined to shoot suspects rather than to arrest them. The other example here I would give is to come back to something that Walter mentioned about the balance between creating effective security institutions and creating accountable security institutions. And I think there's been a tendency or perhaps an imbalance to focus on the former of those tasks rather than on the latter, right? Creating those links of accountability from the actual people on the ground doing security work to the broader political institutions. And this is obviously tricky work, because one of the things you need to do is you need to create effective political oversight while at the same time avoiding excessive political interference. Right? And in the politicized context of most of the environments in which SSR is being undertaken, this is a very difficult balance to find. The third issue that I wanted to raise, again, has come up before, is this broader question of persistence and the idea of SSR as a much longer term project than most of those who are engaged in SSR are willing to accept. I start this discussion by recalling a conversation I had with a Canadian police officer who was doing police reform work in Afghanistan, and I posed a question to him about how long he thought it would be before Afghanistan had a professional politically impartial police force, and his answer was about 50 years. Right? That's still, this was quite a while ago. I think that answer probably is still more or less not unreasonable. There are broader questions of donor fatigue, which obviously come into play here. And obviously this question of persistence links back into the other question of local ownership, because obviously unless and until locals begin to take ownership and push the SSR process themselves, the idea of a 50-year-long reform process is something that most international actors involved in SSR don't want to be engaged in. So I think this is also related to a broader tendency among or a tendency of SSR programming to default to the technical rather than to the political aspects of the issue, and to a certain extent be carried out piecemeal rather than strategically or holistically. And again, this is a particular problem with donors in particular, because of the short-term project-based cultures within they operate, and this sort of necessitates a tendency to focus on discrete SSR projects with clear, quantifiable results. And the bureaucratic logic embedded in this generates powerful pressures to focus on short-term outputs rather than necessarily on longer-term outcomes. So the focus is on the quantitative number of police officers trained, for example, in a particular country, rather than on the qualitative longer-term impacts of such training on public security. And at the same time, I think nobody, and here I would include the United Nations as well, has really fully made the transition to the kind of long-term strategic planning which is widely recognized as necessary for effective and sustainable SSR. So one recent study on UN engagement with SSR, for example, concluded that the international community generally, and the UN in particular, still lacks the capacity to effectively plan and implement long-term reorganization of the security sector in post-conflict environments. And absent this capacity, SSR tends to be carried out in piecemeal fashion. Initiatives tend to focus on technical outputs rather than political outcomes. And I would argue they also generally fail to effectively engage with larger structural questions, such as the nature of the relationship between political actors and security actors, or between security actors and the political communities that they are supposed to serve. So ultimately, I would argue that the SSR enterprise is still struggling to catch up with the very basic reality that SSR is nothing less than large-scale, long-term social engineering focused on the most politically sensitive area of national politics, which is how power is exercised and controlled, and carried out oftentimes in very hyper-politicized political contexts. Let me conclude with just a couple of thoughts on again, the way forward. And I would suggest that what the three issues that I've raised point to is a need for really a greater institutionalization of security sector reform within the international community. This is somewhat ironic, I think, because a lot of the focus on security sector reform to date has been on this very question of capacity building, but it's been capacity building in the context of the receiving countries receiving SSR assistance rather than the capacity of the broader international community. And I think most importantly, those who carry out SSR in the field, whether they are seconded police officers or human rights trainers or individuals seconded to various interior or defense ministries, I think they need to be supported by a much higher level of strategic planning and management capacity than exists at present. And as others have mentioned, some of this is happening. Right? None of this is particularly new. We've seen elements and efforts to try to institutionalize SSR in various UN missions. The Burundi mission of the UN now has an SSR office. The Department of Peacekeeping Operations has an SSR advisor. But in general, I think even the UN would probably admit that the UN's expertise on security sector reform remains context-specific. There's very few people with a sort of broader strategic oversight in terms of the wide range of activities in which SSR touches on, and also somewhat fragmented, right, distributed across various UN departments and agencies. So as I'm alluding to here, I think the kind of strategic planning and management capacity that is necessary would be most logically housed within the UN system. But at the same time, I think donors themselves also must and are beginning to start to think more strategically about their own SSR interventions as part of a broader and necessarily longer-term process that needs to be carefully planned and integrated with other actors, including local actors. So there are a number of examples of this. The UK's conflict prevention pool is one example of this. Stephen mentioned Canada's whole of government approach and the START. So these things are slowly coming together. But ultimately, I would conclude by saying, I think, that if SSR is going to continue to evolve as a field of practice, the broader international community will have to provide better answers to the three questions I've posed this morning. Right. First, how to at least mitigate the often dysfunctional malcoordination between and among organizations involved in SSR questions. Second, how to move beyond the piecemeal and the technocratic on SSR issues, and how to engage more directly with the broader and fundamental political questions posed by SSR. And thirdly and finally, how to manage the international-local divide on SSR issues. And in particular, how to perform the neat trick of simultaneously upholding international norms while at the same time paying more than lip service to questions of local ownership. I'll leave it at there. Thanks very much.